From start, yes. Well, welcome everyone. We're delighted then to welcome Dr. Rachel Clarke to be our first keynote speaker as our autumn programme goes live and we invite people to join us. Rachel's powerful, moving and critically important voice has become a crucial touchstone for many of us this past year as we try to make sense of a still unfolding crisis, one which, as she has put it, is not about numbers, but about human beings. So a few words about Rachel before I hand over. Dr. Rachel Clarke is an NHS palliative care doctor and writer who lives in Oxfordshire with her husband and 2 children. Rachel is the author of 3 Sunday Times best-selling non-fiction books. Breathtaking, published in January 2021, reveals what life was really like working on NHS COVID-19 wards during the first wave of the pandemic. Dear Life, shortlisted for the 2020 Costa Biography Award, longlisted for the 2020 Baillie Gifford Prize, and chosen as a BBC Radio 4 Book of the Week, is based on her work in a hospice. It explores love, loss, grief, dying, and what really matters at the end of life. The Costa Biography judges described it as a beautifully written, powerfully moving book that tackles an emotive and difficult subject with professional compassion and personal insight. Your Life in My Hands, published in 2017, documents life as a junior doctor on the NHS frontline. Before going to medical school, Dr. Rachel Clarke was a broadcast journalist. She produced and directed current affairs documentaries, primarily for Channel 4, focusing on subjects such as Al-Qaeda, the Iraq War, and the civil war in the Democratic Republic of Congo. She began her medical degree at the age of 29, qualifying as a doctor in 2009. Rachel writes for The Guardian, Sunday Times, New York Times, Independent, New Statesman, Telegraph, Prospect, BMJ, NEJM, and The Lancet. She makes regular television and radio appearances on, for example, BBC Question Time, BBC Radio 4 Today, BBC Newsnight, Channel 4 News, GMB, BBC Woman's Hour, ITV News and Sky News, among others. Rachel cares deeply about helping patients live the end of their lives as fully and richly as possible, and in the power of human stories to build empathy and inspire change. So welcome, Rachel, and thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much, Matt, for that really generous introduction and fascinating introduction as well, because for as long as I've worked in palliative medicine in particular, I've been struck by a great many parallels between something of the anxiety and hopelessness it's easy to feel on a kind of macro scale when we confront the climate crisis that we all are living through at the moment. And my specialty at work day to day, when individuals, ordinary men and women, are facing the fact that they're entering a palliative phase of their life, their time is limited, and all of the fear that goes hand in hand with that. And I suppose one of the things which is absolutely integral to being a palliative care doctor is trying to find a way, a narrative, almost a sense of a way of making meaning of the time you have left that makes you feel as though it's precious and valuable, and you can cherish living it, even though you know it's limited. And that's very hard to do. And I think the idea of hope, real hope, not wishful thinking or blind optimism, but proper hope that's grounded in facts, the way the world is, not the way we want it to be, is an incredibly important, valuable way of living through stressful times. And hope is, in a way, what I would like to reflect on with you today. I'm going to speak for probably about half an hour, so that there's plenty of time for questions and discussion afterwards. And I really hope we're able to have a good discussion. So just to start, I've been a palliative care doctor for nearly 5 years now, and the last 18 months of that time, I've been obviously working through a pandemic. And I thought I'd share with you today some quite personal reflections on what the clinical experience of being a palliative care doctor through a pandemic has taught me. First of all, about what matters in medicine, but in a way, much more fundamentally about what matters in life in general, because I feel as though I've come out of the 18 months having learned, maybe in a pretty hard and brutal way, some really important facts about the way we live. And if you think back to the very early days, 18 months ago, of the pandemic, when it was really starting to unfold here in the UK, journalists used, I think, understandably quite dramatic language to describe it. So one of the words was apocalyptic. And to be honest, from my perspective on the front line of the NHS, that seemed a very appropriate and apt way of describing what was unfolding. We were in this sort of incredibly chaotic and traumatic race against time to sort of reconfigure the entire health service so we could help patients who had COVID. And it felt very desperate and urgent. But I think it's interesting that the original meaning, the Greek etymology behind that word apocalypse, is that the meaning stems not around calamity, but revelation. So an apocalypse in biblical times is an event that reveals something profound and true that would otherwise remain hidden. And when I was sitting up late last night thinking about this talk, I realized that for me, the most important lessons, the truths that I have discovered in the last 18 months, interestingly, don't center on loss, death and dying, even though that's been a large part of my experience. It has been about hope, and in particular, I think hope's tenacity. So I have come out of the last 18 months more hopeful than I went in. And that is never something I would have predicted. And I thought it might be interesting to explain why. So to start, I'm just going to read you a couple of lines of poetry. Now, this is not a poem I've written. It is one that my daughter wrote last summer. So we'd come out of the first wave, and she was absolutely hating homeschooling, missing her friends terribly. And for her English homework, Abby, who was 9 then, was asked to write a poem about lockdown. And I'll just read you this little bit of it. So she wrote, "We're racing around, squealing like pigs, feet stamping the ground and snapping twigs. Now we laugh and have a munch. We love our delicious school lunch. I'm tucked up cozy in my bed, dreaming of what I could do instead. And I stare at the silver moon above and cry for all the things I love." And I share that with you just because when she wrote this poem, apart from being very proud of her rhyming couplets, I was incredibly moved by what she wrote. I couldn't believe that she was missing school meals. And I knew that what she meant really was she was missing everything about school, the camaraderie and her friends and teachers and the excitement of being at school. And I also realized, and it kind of drew me up short with a jolt, that I really had no idea what it was like for my family, my husband and 2 children, to be locked down. And their world of homeschooling and boredom and limits and frustration was so alien to me, because I wasn't locked down. I was a million miles away, inhabiting this world behind the closed doors of the hospital that was completely immersive. And having that realization was a bit of a turning point for me, because it made me realize that the world I inhabited was every bit as foreign and alien to my family and to anyone else who wasn't there inside the hospital. And it reminded me of that famous quote by Susan Sontag, where she writes about there being two countries, the country of the well and the ill, and how we all have a passport for each of those countries, and sometime or another, whether we like it or not, we will enter that world of the ill. But actually, no one was last year, unless you are actually working, because hospitals were closed to almost everyone in the public. So I started to think at that time very seriously about writing, and I have always written for myself. I was doing a lot of writing during the first wave last year, really for not much more than therapy in a sense, because it was so traumatic. And I always, if I'm stressed, I don't sleep. And so I would just spend night after night kind of sitting in the kitchen, bashing away on my keyboard so that I didn't wake my husband up. And it was just a way of, I don't know, trying to deal with what we were seeing every day. But at this time, when Abby wrote her poem, it was probably May, June time. That was when I really seriously started thinking about trying to turn what I had written and what I was still writing into a book, because I really wanted to try to take people into this alien world and understand what it was like. And I think this was a time, if you think back to then, we were all starting to get pretty fractious and pretty frustrated, because we'd come out of the first wave, we were still in lockdown, we were all obeying the rules very fastidiously. Dominic Cummings had just gone off and tested his eyes by driving to Barnard Castle, and there was a lot of resentment building. And I just felt really strongly at the time that inside the NHS, there was a story that I wanted to tell, and I wanted to tell it because it was true and it was real. And this was a story about what patients and their families and members of staff were going through, how much tenacity and strength and resilience they were finding to deal with these horrendous circumstances. And I felt as though my testimony might be very flawed, it might be subjective and personal, and I could never pretend it was anything historical, but there was surely something of value in trying to document all of the rawness of that time. It seemed to me to have a purpose, particularly when so much was being written and said about what was happening inside hospitals, perhaps by politicians or journalists who weren't there inside. And I suppose I had a particular story I wanted to try and articulate, and it was this idea that despite everything, literally every day that I would go into work, I was blown away by the sheer grit and, I don't know, strength and compassion of pretty much everybody around me. And it was an extraordinary thing to witness. So if you go back now 18 months and think back to that first wave, it's hard almost to remember now how frightening it was, because then we had no vaccines, no treatments at all. It was a completely new disease, and COVID had already overwhelmed China and Italy, and here it was now overwhelming us. And in London in particular, in the first wave, it was absolutely terrifying how quickly hospitals were being overwhelmed. I asked straight away if I could move from my hospice to the hospital. I wanted to be on the wards working with COVID patients. I wanted to be using my skills where they were most helpful, and I wasn't even slightly unusual in that pretty much everyone I knew felt the same. We were trained, and we just wanted to do what we could to help. And so life became very different very, very quickly. We all had our PPE training, learned how to put on all our protective equipment, and my routine became leave the house early, sometimes even before the family were up, work in the hospital all day, come home, and literally I would have already taken my dirty scrubs off at work and put on new clothes, but I would get home, I would wipe down and sanitize the front door handle, my car keys, my phone. I'd strip off my clothes, straight away put them in the washing machine with my scrubs. I wouldn't let the children come near me. They weren't allowed to touch me. I'd go straight upstairs and shower, wash myself from top to toe to get rid of the COVID. And that was a big change in life. And inside the hospital, it was really tough. I wasn't in intensive care. So I think in a way, a lot of the narrative last year was all about ventilators and saving people if we could in intensive care. But of course, the vast majority of people who succumbed to this horrible virus were never in intensive care. They were never fit or strong enough to even be considered for a ventilator, because the doctors knew that if they did go onto a ventilator, we'd never be able to get them off again. And so they were on the wards, and that's where I was based. So I was seeing many hundreds of patients with COVID on the wards. And I thought I would share with you 3 very brief vignettes that, to my mind, to encapsulate a lot of what that experience was like. And the first of which is, I think, I sort of imagine this now as a painting, as I don't know, as a Dennis Hopper or something, but it was this scene that I saw a few times as I arrived in the hospital before I understood what it meant. And then suddenly when I worked it out, I literally sort of stopped in my tracks. And this was the scene of the empty car park outside the hospital that was always almost entirely empty, because of course we had no visitors in the hospital, but there would always be a small number of cars, a handful, and they would always be pointing right at the front entrance of the hospital, and they always had someone inside, maybe 3 or 4 or 5 of these cars, and their inhabitants would just be sitting there staring at the hospital. And I suddenly realized what this meant. These were people who wanted to be inside, who desperately wanted to be with their patients who were on the other side of those closed hospital doors, and they couldn't be there, but their physical longing and yearning to be close and be with the people they loved was so profound that it propelled them to be right there, sitting, just staring as close as they could be. And I just found that, of all the images, one of the most poignant, because of what it seemed to say about how desperately we want to be close to each other when we're frightened and sick. And then following on from that, another vignette, I remember at one stage, sometimes people were allowed to visit, particularly if a patient was judged to be very close to the end of life, if they were dying. And sometimes children were allowed to visit. They would say goodbye to a parent. And there was one occasion when I met a family, a dad and 2 little girls, and I had to help them all into their PPE. I had to explain what they were going to see when they visited the little girl's mum, and show them how to put on their PPE. And the little girls had put on their smart party dresses to look nice for mum, but I had to cover them up with their aprons and help them put on masks. And I watched this little procession go down the corridor, and the little girls had gowns trailing on the floor behind them because, of course, nobody makes PPE for children. It's all made for adults. But here were children wearing it. And I just thought, again, that's a sight no one should ever have to see, because it shouldn't happen. We should not be putting up barriers between children and their parents of plastic at a time like this. And yet we had to, COVID forced that to happen. And one of the things that always haunted me from the word go was this idea that if you came to hospital during the pandemic, and in fact, what I'm about to say still applies now, if you come to hospital and if you do not survive your admission, then from the moment you arrive, you are destined never to see a human face again, because everybody you encounter, every member of staff, and even your relatives, your family, your loved ones, if they come to visit, they're all wearing a mask. So you don't see a human face, you don't see someone smiling, you just see eyes above masks. And slightly more positively, this last vignette I want to share is I think an example of this strength I've alluded to. So we were all so traumatized by the barriers that COVID put up. Of course, they were necessary. We had to have infection control measures to stop other people being infected, including ourselves. But they really did seem to attack something very, very profound about our humanity as healthcare providers, as simply as human beings, which is that when someone is suffering, particularly if someone is dying, every molecule of your being is sort of screaming to provide them with care and comfort and kindness. And the last thing you want at a patient's bedside, particularly if it is a deathbed, is those awful barriers. And there was one occasion when a colleague of mine, a nurse that I'll call her Nick, she did something really extraordinary. We had a patient who was very distressed, and they knew they were dying. And very, very often, it's quite incredible how the most powerful thing at a patient's bedside is not morphine or any other strong, powerful drug. It really is a human presence. So sometimes the most frightening and painful and distressing thing about approaching the end of life is not physical symptoms. It's just the psychology, the enormity of what's happening to you. And the flip side of that is that if someone is there supporting you and making sure you don't feel alone, it can be enormously powerful. So we were in a situation where a patient was very distressed, and we had given various medications which were not really touching the distress. And there was a moment when Nick intuited that what she needed to do was not possible officially according to the rules. So we were meant to have no contact with patients, physical contact, unless strictly necessary. But she intuited in that moment that actually what was necessary, what this patient needed more than anything, was physical, tactile compassion. And the patient had COVID, but regardless of the risks to herself, she took this woman, distressed woman, in her arms and cradled her as a mother might cradle a child. She held her close, and her face sort of fell onto Nick's chest, and she cradled her, and the distress evaporated. It just melted away, because what that patient, that human being, needed in that moment was something that only physical holding and cuddling and cherishing could provide. And again, that's just that is a little vignette that I will never forget. And afterwards, Nick, the nurse, went away, stripped, showered, washed herself down, put on new PPE, but she had risked her life to do that. And I'm pleased to say did not catch COVID, but she did that because she had to. There was something in her that drove that. And I share those experiences really to try and give a flavour of what was hardest, I think, for all of us inside the hospital. It was this, it was the sometimes seemingly insurmountable barriers between us and patients, and the terrible distress around family members not being able to visit routinely, but also the ferocity, in a way, of our desire to somehow circumvent them and somehow keep on providing good, compassionate care. And there are 1,000 ways in which people try to do that. We would connect families through smartphones, tablets, screens. We would sit there and play favourite pieces of music that family members would send in or tell us to play with their loved ones. We would sometimes read poems or letters at the bedside that somebody had written for a patient in hospital. And in every conceivable way, we tried to make up this compassion gap. And I think what I learned from all of that, and by all of that, I suppose I would say now I'm a palliative care doctor who has experienced enough death and dying in 1 year to probably last an entire lifetime. I would say that what I have learned is that in a time of crisis, when ordinary people are facing unbelievably challenging, apocalyptic times, it's really remarkable how much guts people have. So for NHS staff, trying to provide humanity in a world of pandemic medicine was not at all easy. It took real effort of will to do that. And in a way, it would have been much easier not to try and go the extra mile. We could have just gritted our teeth and accepted this environment was terrible and almost refused to engage with it as a way of protecting yourself. Because if you try to engage, inevitably you're responding emotionally, and that means you're much more likely to cry on the way home at the end of a difficult shift. But people didn't do that. They just carried on. And it struck me that while the focus was very much on intensive care in the media, it was all about ventilators and sort of high-tech kit. What I was seeing every day at work was a different kind of intensive care. This was intensive care of the human kind. We were striving intensively to deliver humanity every day as much as possible at patients' bedsides. And we were not doing that because we were special in any way at all. We were not heroes. We were not angels. We were none of those things. We were just ordinary, flawed, frail, hopeless, scared, tired human beings, just like anyone else. And that is what gave me grounds for renewed hope. It was the fact that you could be knackered and weak and struggling, but would still put everything you had into providing humane and tender care. That just gave me such tenacious grounds for hope. And of course, that leads on to a much broader point about British society last year, last springtime, and throughout. I think it's easy in mid-2021, where there's endless toxicity and ferocious argument and a lot of bile out there, particularly on social media around COVID. There's lots of COVID denial, there's lots of anti-vaccination hatred, all of that. Nevertheless, we should not forget the fact that last year and throughout much of the pandemic, the British population writ large, I think, has also conducted ourselves with an absolutely remarkable degree of strength and humility. So I remember in March last year when we went into lockdown and suddenly every village, every street, every little local community was setting up these spontaneous little grassroots collectives of people that were trying their hardest to help their most vulnerable neighbours. So, streets had a WhatsApp group to organise shopping or collecting prescriptions and medicines for people who were shielding and isolating at home. I remember early on asking my sister if she had a pair of Crocs I could borrow because I needed some shoes like that in A&E, and she messaged her little COVID Street WhatsApp group, and instantly, pretty much within half an hour, 10 pairs of Crocs had been dropped off at her doorstep, and I was able to give them to lots of people who were now in A&E. And it was just one tiny example of this astonishing outpouring of generosity and desire to help each other that had been unleashed by circumstances that were unprecedented and dreadful and required us all to step up. And that's what the population did. They stepped up. It also strikes me that in the same way that my little girl, Abby, last year was grieving the loss of something, she was in her own way suffering because she had lost the experience of school and her friends at school. In the same way, every single person in British society has lost something over the last 18 months. I think we have all struggled, we've all tried our best, but we've all lost something, whether it is our own health, the life of someone we love, our job, our financial security, our sense of well-being and confidence in a world where an invisible threat pervades the very air we breathe. Everybody has lost something. And I will just share with you a quote from Nick Cave, who some of you may know, the singer-songwriter Nick Cave. His son died when he was still in his teens, and he writes beautifully about grief. He says here, "There is a vastness to grief that overwhelms our minuscule selves. We are tiny, trembling clusters of atoms subsumed within grief's awesome presence." And I think that somehow encapsulates the pandemic. For me, I think we have all been collectively grieving the loss of something, and nevertheless have demonstrated incredible spontaneous philanthropy, kindness to each other, to society's most vulnerable members whenever we can. So, to conclude, that is the reason why I'm hopeful. I have learned so much about what human beings are and what we're capable of in the last 18 months. And I think if I was trying to sum up what I've learned, I would say it's about love. I have been taught by coronavirus what love really means and how much of it there is in society. COVID showed me that we do love and care about our fellow citizens, that there is such a thing as society, and that most people, most of the time, try their hardest to be good. And it seems to me that that revelation not only is true, but it means more and lasts more than anything else, and that is a truth that cannot be stolen by COVID, by a government, by online hate, or any of these dark and daunting forces that we sometimes might feel hopeless and impotent in the face of. I've seen something remarkable over the last 18 months, and I think we all have. And that's what I wanted to share with you today. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Rachel. That was an incredible presentation. And, I'm struck silent, but actually, to be honest, there's so much there that it feels almost sort of trite to come back at too quickly. I just wanted to, I'll just pluck one thing from it, and then I can see there's one or two other questions coming in. I stupidly forgot to say at the beginning, do drop questions into chat, or just say, I'd like to ask a question, and then Richard can invite you to unmute to everyone here. So come and join us in questions. My first question is just more of a response, really. When you told that story about Nick, I mean, it was extraordinary how that concentrated everything you were saying and made it so movingly present. It really reminded me of my own experience of the brilliant palliative care team in the Marsden Hospital when my dad was dying, and particularly a woman called Meryl, who was our Nick. But I thought you used a phrase around that, about the compassion gap, about this thing that we swim in, this kind of gap. And I thought, for me, that's probably where I'd begin a conversation about what the pandemic and the ecological crisis both bring us face to face with. Is, for me, speaking as a kind of privileged British person living in a quiet coastal town, both of them tend to be things that happen elsewhere. They happen on this enormous scale. You used phrases like a million miles away. That is the kind of surreality of the pandemic, I think, and why your witnessing has been so powerful for many of us this year, is because it's not just the PPE, it's the whole removal from it. And we just go about, you know, that hasn't even really formed itself into a question. But yeah, thanks. If there's anything else you want to say about compassion gaps, please do, or I'll see if other people can be more precise in their questions.
Well, I think, I just think in a way that is, I'm glad you mentioned that phrase, because to my mind, in a way, that's the heart of it. And I think this is the heart of why it's difficult to be a good doctor, and maybe why it's difficult to be a good human being as well. It is hard to care about things. If you care about your patients or anyone that you love, or the world around you that you love, then you are exposing yourself to risk and pain, because the more you love something, the greater the threat looms that you may lose that something, and all of that love may turn into loss and grief. And I see that every day in the hospice, where we are trying our hardest to help a patient with all of the aspects of losing your life, the kinds of suffering that are fixable. So most pain is fixable, an awful lot of suffering is fixable, but I just think there's a really profound kind of suffering that we cannot ever fix, because it goes hand in hand with us being mortal creatures who are impermanent. We know that every single thing we love in the world, every single one we love in the world, one way or another, we are going to be cleaved apart from them, because they are going to die or we are going to die. And we somehow have to live our lives lovingly, kind of throwing out our care with abandon, knowing that the more we do it, the more painful it's going to be. And we do it over and over again. And of course we do, because you wouldn't want to live any other way. We could barricade ourselves behind walls and be careless, try to protect ourselves by eliminating care, but that's no way to live at all. But there's something so astonishing to me and poignant about the price of caring, which is pain in some shape or form. That's something I wrestle with when I think about the ecological crisis we face, because of course it's happening before our eyes. In some ways, I think you can look at the world and see its frailties and see that it might be in a palliative state right now, and that's painful to witness.
Thank you for that. I'd love to come back to that and a bit later and to talk about hope in that context, but I'd like to bring in some of our guests now, and let's start with you, Joe Smith. If you're able to unmute, why don't you join us with your question for Rachel?
Hi, Rachel. Thank you for that. Really, really touching. I'm a bereavement counsellor, so I do, well, Zoom mostly now. See a lot of clients experiencing loss and grief. You're experiencing the before, and I just wonder how you take care of yourself, because we're talking about such massive trauma. And I know as a bereavement support worker that I need to take care of myself, because it impacts my sense of well-being, and it's just huge. So I just wonder how you cope with it, how you take care of yourself and your body and your mind. And
yeah, it's really difficult, and there is now among staff in the NHS and in care homes as well, just a huge amount of anxiety, depression, PTSD, all of that is through the roof. I think I found in the first wave, in a way, I was already trained in a sense to know that you can't suppress it. So in palliative care, we're much better than many branches of medicine that in recognizing that actually we need to support each other, because there are often experiences that are very, very sad. And so we do support each other. And I think there's a tendency, especially among doctors, to put on that sort of stiff upper lip and pretend you're fine. But I used to routinely, I would spend a day at work, and I would, on the way home, I'd be driving home, and I would literally pull over by the side of the road and cry, and then sort of get myself together and come home, because I couldn't bring what I'd seen into my husband's life. There was nothing to be gained from that. So I had to sort of let it out somehow. And I think I found in December, the hardest bit for many people was that awful second wave in December, January, when so many of the deaths happened. And the kind of anguish of knowing that it was going to happen again, seeing it unfolding again before our eyes, and being powerless to stop it, when the government was still talking about a 5-day sort of see all your family at Christmas. It was almost unbearable seeing us making the same mistake second time round. And there was a point then when there was one day when I was on my way to work, and my mind was absolutely sort of diamond hard going to work, wanting to do the job, and my body kind of mutinied, and I started having a panic attack where I literally felt as though I was having a heart attack, and I had to pull over. I couldn't drive. I had chest pain and couldn't breathe and all of that. And I knew it was stress, but it didn't stop it being overwhelming. And at that stage, I really thought, I may not be able to do this. But I talked to colleagues, and that's how we got through it. We talked to each other. And it's really interesting, though, even now, how little we talk about it. I think everybody feels as though it's been harder for someone else than them. And so you sort of feel like you haven't got the right to talk about your experience, in a sense, because it's much harder for the people in ICU, or it's much harder for these people. And so you just, I don't know, that's what helps, talking about it. And I have some really close friends, nursing and medical friends, who I think, in the same way that a soldier gets through the battlefield with their little, I want to say battalion, I'm sure that's a big thing. You know what I mean? Your little platoon, or whatever your little group of fellow soldiers is. If you've been through it together, then you know they understand it all and you understand it all. And so you just support each other, and that's it. You share it by sort of spreading it on across lots of people's shoulders.
Fantastic. Thank you. I keep thinking what you're saying is really so simple and down to earth, and it sort of comes down to this thing, basic point about empathy and relationship, that I don't want to sort of try and overcomplicate that, but I'm getting mixed up now between things you said elsewhere and things you said just now, but you spoke about a woman patient in spasming with grief, her children growing up without a mother, and you said there are things I can palliate. I can palliate her physical pain, and I thought that idea that what we palliate I hadn't thought about that before. There are some things. There's a difference between palliation and just medication, or the way in which. I wondered again if there's a kind of link there to that theme. I don't want to keep insisting on that theme, because it's not, in a way, it's just an outrider to much of what you've said. But it seems to me, in the whole conversation around ecological anxiety, there's a sort of ambivalent relationship to palliation. It's in some ways, the answer to ecological anxiety is to feel more of it, is to feel it more rawly, is to not, as Extinction Rebellion say, hope dies, action begins, so I don't know if there's any more of that.
No, absolutely. And so, and I love my etymology, and the etymology of palliare is I'm not sure if it's Greek or Latin. I think it's Latin word, palliare, meaning to cloak. So this idea that to palliate something is to sort of cloak it, cover it up, and make it go away. And that, of course, is exactly what a painkiller will do to a pain. So you give morphine and it suppresses the pain, it makes it go away, it hides it. And that idea of the essence of palliative care being cloaking, I think is sort of on the one hand right, and at the same time absolutely the opposite of what we need to do. So it's great to take away a pain, but actually if you are working with patients who are themselves having to confront the enormity of being mortal, the loss of their life, having to leave the people they love, then trying to sort of cloak or downplay or mask or suppress that is really, I think, not helpful. I think it's counterproductive. I think sometimes I'll meet patients for the first time, and the sheer relief that they find in being able to talk openly about the fact that they're dying, and what in particular they're frightened of, or what in particular matters to them, is in itself a kind of morphine. It's just fantastic for them to be able to talk openly, because so many people, understandably, in their lives are sort of treading on eggshells and worrying about bringing these topics up in case they cause distress. And sometimes the thing that is most valuable and important for a patient is to be able to scream from the rooftops and say, I don't want to die. I love my kids. I love my husband. I don't want to die. And have someone else sit with them and hear that and not try to diminish it, but respect it and just sit with them so they know they're not alone when they're expressing that anguish. And I think you're absolutely right about this in relation to the environment. If we suppress our distress at the ecological, just awful loss that is happening every day around us, then we're disengaging. It's still happening, but we're almost anesthetizing ourselves to it. We're suppressing our distress because it's hard to live with. Whereas I think perhaps really the way to manage that distress is to channel it somehow into some kind of action. And I don't mean kind of campaigning on the barricades, whatever that action might be. You know, I write a lot because I find it helpful. It might be, you know, it might be joining a local conservation group, whatever it might be. But if you can use your distress, you know, tiny little shape or form, you sort of holding up a flag and saying, I resist, I don't want this, then maybe that's a way of living with how you feel and not just shutting yourself down.
Brilliant. That's a great, there's a whole manifesto in that answer. Thank you. I've got a couple of questions. Let's see how we're doing time. We've got just over 5 minutes, and I've got, I know Richard had a question that I haven't let in yet. Sorry, Richard. But Emma, I'm going to jump you, Richard, and go to Emma Hambley, who's got a question. And then maybe you'd like to come in last.
Hi, I hope you don't mind if I keep my camera off. I keep it off for privacy reasons. Thanks. Thank you so much, Rachel. That was an amazing and wonderful talk. I think one thing I'm interested in, I'm a visual artist, but I previously cared for somebody through cancer, so I have a tiny sense of something of this. I was very struck last year about how the hospitals were closed to the visual media. And I obviously understand that there is no desire to fetishize anything that was going on, but I wonder whether you have any thoughts about, well, maybe there are some very good films or programs that I don't know about that help to, because I think this maybe goes back to your last comments about cloaking. There's an element of segregation which that imposes on the whole process, which I find maybe somewhat unsettling. You know, there's a separation between the wider community and something of the actuality of the process. And I just wonder whether you have any thoughts on that, or if you know of any particular films or works of art or anything that you think reflect something about that.
Yes, yeah, very interesting question. And I absolutely agree with you that one of the, I think, unintended consequences of NHS England having a really very draconian media policy throughout the pandemic has been the creation of a real barrier between what patients and staff and families who have been inside the NHS have experienced versus the vast majority of people outside. And of course, that barrier has also fueled a lot of disinformation and toxicity on social media. So for instance, before Christmas, sort of November, December time, there was a spate of individuals who would go inside hospitals late at night and film an empty outpatient department and then post this footage saying online on Facebook or Twitter saying, look, this these hospitals are empty, it's all a lie, it's a scamdemic, COVID isn't real. And I used to be very vocal in response to this, along with many other NHS members of staff, and we would just receive the most incredible abuse for standing up saying, this isn't true, this is disinformation, COVID's real, it's deadly, people are dying now, please take this seriously. I would be called Satan, Hitler, a child abuser, kind of you name it. It was that. I've been called far worse than all those things on social media. Incredible. You'd get rape threats, death threats, amazing stuff. And I think it is easy to hate if you are frightened and if you are frustrated and if there is a gulf between you and what's actually happening inside an institution. So I think that NHS England made a big mistake in trying to control the media narrative in a very draconian way. I imagine they came under considerable pressure from above, from Number 10 to do that. But I think the consequence of it was they inadvertently fueled people who had an agenda of disinformation and wanted the public to become mistrustful and doubtful and skeptical of scientists and doctors. And the best way to sort of break down those barriers is, of course, to hear from real human beings, to hear real human testimony. There's nothing more powerful than a human story. And so some really wonderful documentaries. So the 23rd of March this year was the 1-year anniversary of the first day of lockdown. And I know that Channel 4 that week broadcast an incredible, I think it was a 90-minute documentary that was called something like The Day the World Stopped Still, or The Day the Country Stopped Still, something like that. It'll be very easy to find on Catch Up. And the BBC that week as well ran a series which was about the impact of COVID all over the world, including the UK, and it was outstandingly good. And again, their names all merge into one. But if you Googled for that week, you'd find it. And the other thing, if anybody is in London, that I would really recommend is paying a visit to the COVID Memorial Wall on the South Bank. And this is, I really believe it's one of the most extraordinary public art installations that I've ever seen. And it was created by bereaved families who'd been bereaved by COVID, and each of them painted a red heart on the wall, Albert Embankment, to symbolise the person they had lost. And one heart was painted for every single life that's been lost, so over 150,000 people. It's a very provocative piece of art. It sits right opposite Downing Street, so it's a statement. It's a sort of howl of anguish almost that's been painted on a wall. And there's something so moving about these little heart icons, which are in a way, nothing more than an overused emoji, but collectively it takes 10 minutes to walk the length of that wall, and you are just suddenly hit by the scale of the loss. And it's a really extraordinary experience. And I would so recommend that to anybody if they're in London. It's profoundly moving.
Thank you so much.
That's a fantastic place to end. Thank you, Rachel. I'm going up in late August, and I'm definitely going to make that my first stop before going to see my mum in South London. And I just wanted to say again, I'm so delighted that we've been able to start the arc towards the Borrowed Time 3-day summit in November here with our sort of feet on the ground with you in the middle of this pandemic that we've been living through this last year, and just get so much from your account of it. And I wanted to end just with a give back to another etymology note. Our previous guest, Stephen Jenkinson, who you may know, who's obviously been a very long time speaker from within a palliative care perspective, experience. I remember him, when you were speaking about apocalypse and then Pagliari, you reminded me of him talking about catastrophe and how it's incumbent on all of us to be good catastrophic thinkers now. And he said that we hear a lot about catastrophe, but that it's actually quite a recent turn in that word's history. I think about the 16th century began to be associated with just an out and out denouement, a terrible thing. And that before that, in its Greek sense, katastrophe meant a turn down and in, a kind of a going inside and down, a going down that takes you into the heart of things or brings you closer to what's underneath the surface, something like that. So that's certainly that was a kind of long-winded thank you for a great talk. But yes, from all of us, really, there's lots of, I don't know if you can see the chat from where you are, but there's lots of great appreciation for what you've given us in the chat, and just really grateful for it. Really great start to our event.
Thank you very much.
Good luck with everything you're doing.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.